You're in darkness, real darkness. Beyond the cockpit windows, there's nothing. No horizon line, no ground, no sky, just black. But you're not alone. Behind you are hundreds of people, sleeping, trusting you. And one of them is the mother of your two sons. And now, everything you've been trained to rely on starts to break. The screens are still on, but they're no longer telling the same story. One indicator says you're speeding up, another says you're slowing down. An alarm sounds, then stops, then it sounds again. And at this point, no one is giving you the right answer. There are only options, and every option has risk. Your mind is suddenly full of voices at the same time. Training, experience, instinct, fear. Which one is real? Which one saves you? You have to make a decision, but you don't even know how much time you have. This is what the human brain does next. It simplifies, because the complexity becomes impossible to carry. Science calls it cognitive overload, but to you it feels like drowning. Now you're at a crossroads. One part of you says, stop, take a breath, follow the procedure, check everything step by step. But another part whispers, what if there's no time? What if this is your last chance? What if you don't decide now? You'll never get the chance to decide again. And something very important happens here. Human instinct evolved to keep you alive, but that instinct doesn't always work in the right context. Sometimes, trying to save you, it pushes you into a bigger mistake. So let me ask you, if every system is contradicting itself, if the warnings aren't clear, if you can't even tell what you're looking at in the dark, what would you choose? Training, instinct, or some third option? That doesn't really exist. This channel is called Would You Choose This? And in this video, we're talking about more than why a plane went down. We're talking about how the human brain, under the wrong conditions, can make a decision that feels right and still step into a point of no return. And maybe the most unsettling question of all, if you were there, would you truly have made a different choice? On the day of Air France Flight 447, everything was exactly how it was supposed to be. The aircraft would depart from Rio de Janeiro and land in Paris roughly 11 hours later. Pre-flight procedures were completed. The pilots reviewed the weather. Fuel was calculated. The crew boarded. Passengers boarded. Some were traveling for work. Some were returning from vacation. Some were about to see loved ones again. The plane took off. Both passengers and crew believed they were about to experience a routine journey under weather conditions considered normal for this route over the ocean. Meteorological data showed nothing unusual, nothing that looked like an extreme threat. Air France, one of the world's oldest and most established airlines, was flying an Airbus A330. At the time, it was one of the newest generations of commercial aircraft. So advanced that aviation experts would say long-haul flights were almost flying themselves. The aircraft could analyze weather patterns, optimize the flight automatically, and in many situations calculate faster than a human pilot. It was built to reduce human error, built to protect people. And that's exactly why no one expected anything abnormal on this flight. The first hours were completely ordinary. Automation was engaged. The flight was stable. The night over the Atlantic was quiet. Everything was normal. Because the route passed near the equator, where storms can build silently, and because the total flight time was over 10 hours, standard long-haul procedures were in place. That's why there were 3 pilots on board. The captain was Marc Dubois, 58 years old. He had roughly 11,000 flight hours, including about 1,700 hours on the Airbus A330, and deep experience on the South America to Paris route. Since joining the Airbus A330 and a 340 division in 2007, he had completed 16 rotations on that route. In the right seat was Pierre-Cédric Bonin, the least experienced of the 3 pilots. He had approximately 2,936 flight hours, including about 807 hours on the Airbus A330 and 5 rotations on the South America route since joining the division. In the observer seat behind them sat David Robert, 37 years old. He joined Air France in 1998 and had around 6,547 flight hours, including 4,479 hours on the A330. Since transitioning to the A330 and A340 fleet in 2002, he had completed 39 rotations on the South America route. He had also worked in management at Air France's operations center at one point, but continued flying to maintain proficiency. That's part of why he was on this flight. This long-haul flight was happening during the hours when human biology is at its weakest. According to long-haul procedure, David Robert was sent for the first rest period. The rest schedule had been planned before departure. Later, Captain Dubois called David Robert back to the cockpit so the captain could take his own rest period. Before leaving the cockpit, the captain listened to the standard briefing given by Bonin to David. Nothing unusual had happened up to that point. No elevated risk, no special warning. And before going to rest, the captain did not add any additional briefing of his own. Because at that moment, there was nothing to brief. At around 2:01, Captain Dubois left the cockpit to rest. From that moment on, by standard rules and task division, pilot flying authority was with Pierre-Cédric Bonin. David Robert was the pilot monitoring. Everything was still normal. Automation was working. The aircraft continued quietly through the night over the Atlantic. No one knew that minutes later, this flight would become one of the most debated and most analyzed accidents in aviation history. In the cockpit, the 2 pilots studied a large cloud mass ahead on the radar. In equatorial flights, this kind of weather formation wasn't unusual. After a short discussion, they decided on a roughly 12-degree turn to the left to avoid the core of the storm. It seemed like enough, but the aircraft couldn't fully stay clear of the edge of this cloud system, loaded with water and ice crystals. In that moment, it didn't feel abnormal to anyone inside the cockpit. No one realized yet that this small change was about to trigger a chain of events. Minutes after that slight route adjustment, while everything still looked normal inside the cockpit, something critical began happening outside the plane. And this was the moment being tested wasn't the pilots. It was the sensors. On the nose of the aircraft, on the front of the fuselage, there were a few small sensors called pitot tubes. They don't directly measure how fast the plane is going. They measure air pressure from the airflow outside, and the computers translate that into what you see as airspeed. So those airspeed numbers in the cockpit weren't surviving on pilot instinct. They were surviving on a few thin tubes, measuring correctly. That night, at high altitude, along the edge of that ice crystal cloud system, those tubes began to block temporarily. The pilots couldn't see this happening. No visible icing on the windows, no explosion, no physical warning. Just numbers, slowly beginning to contradict each other on the screens. The airspeed indicators were no longer agreeing, And right then, the first sound they heard was sharp and unmistakable. The autopilot disconnect warning. That sound was saying, "I'm gone. Control is yours." Up to this point, it was unusual but still manageable. Control was now in Pierre-Cédric Bonin's hands. He had one job: to keep flying manually and understand why the autopilot had dropped out. But what he saw in the cockpit didn't offer one clear answer. The airspeed readings didn't match. One screen seemed to show speed dropping. Another still looked normal. Was the plane losing altitude? Was it accelerating? The systems weren't speaking clearly. And when the human brain meets uncertainty, it feels pressure to do something. Because doing nothing feels like the most dangerous choice of all. The aircraft began to roll slightly to the right. Airspeed readings dropped abruptly. We don't know exactly which data Bonin trusted in that moment, but the inconsistent numbers were still there. And Bonin, forced to take manual control, reacted instinctively. He tried to correct the roll and stabilize the flight with a pitch-up input. From this point on, human input was now part of the chain. The flight control mode changed. Some protections were reduced, and the aircraft's response became more directly tied to Bonin's inputs. As he tried to correct it, the aircraft began to oscillate left to right, then back again. His attention narrowed onto the control problem, and at the same time, the pitch-up input continued. The pitch kept increasing, leading to a very high rate of climb. Everything was happening at once. And when the autopilot dropped out and warnings began, a short stall warning sounded in the cockpit for the first time.
Stall.
When Bonin shouted,
"We don't have a good indication."
They were only 11 seconds into the emergency. David, who was responsible for managing abnormal checklists, called out,
"We've lost the speeds. Alternate law, protection law."
a mode where many of the aircraft's protective systems are no longer available. Bonin answered,
"Engine lever?"
It was clear there was confusion. At 18 seconds, the cockpit displays were showing around 10 different fault messages, each with its own warning sound, and it was obvious they could not trust what the instruments were doing. They had to solve it. Because, in that moment, there was nowhere to escape. No waiting, no outside help. Just two humans who had to decide. David Robert was trying to understand what was happening, but inside the cockpit, nothing was simple. He noticed the high pitch and called out,
"Watch your speed."
Bonin said,
"Okay, I'm going back down."
and pushed forward, but not enough. It only reduced the climb rate. The aircraft kept climbing. Fighting the sensitive controls, David urged him to stabilize the aircraft. Then he said,
"Go back down. According to all three, you are going up, so go back down."
While David tried to regain meaningful readings, he also pressed the call button to bring the captain back into the cockpit. 3 seconds later, the stall warning sounded again and continued continuously for the next 54 seconds. At this point, the aircraft no longer had the energy to maintain that climb. Instead, it was rocking side to side, and Bonin was still trying desperately to correct it with the control stick. They didn't realize they were approaching a fully developed stall. Let's clarify something here. A stall can happen in many attitudes. The key factor is the angle of attack. A stall is when the wing can no longer meet the airflow at the right angle, and it stops producing lift. The engines may still be running, instruments may still be showing something, but the aircraft has stopped flying. The stall warning had been sounding for seconds, and Bonin's pitch-up command continued, almost continuously, for nearly a full minute. That decision may have felt right in the moment, but this is where human instinct and aerodynamic reality split apart. At high altitude, when airspeed information isn't reliable, pulling the nose up doesn't save you. it can silently push you deeper into a stall. And what drove it wasn't a dramatic panic. It was a reflexive human mistake. In those seconds, Bonin said he didn't have control of the aircraft. David, the more experienced A330 pilot, pressed the takeover button, saying,
Controls to the left.
and inside the cockpit, a loop formed that looked like this. The warning sounds. A pilot changes something. The warning stops. It feels like, did it fix it? Seconds later, the warning returns. This is one of the hardest scenarios for the human brain, because the brain tries to create a cause and effect story. But here, the relationship was backwards. When the pilot pushed the nose down slightly, the speed sensors briefly produced values that looked reasonable, and the stall warning would return. And that can create a deadly perception. Every time I push down, the warning starts, so pushing down must be wrong. When in reality, pushing down was exactly what needed to happen. At the same time, the aircraft was buffeting, the engines were running, altitude was dropping fast. But the nose attitude still looked high. It was a sensory contradiction. Normally, something falling points down and speeds up. But here, the aircraft was descending at a very high rate while the nose was still up and the engines were producing power. That disconnect breaks your body's perception, and it breaks the meaning of the screens. And then, the captain entered the cockpit during a period when the stall warning was stopping and restarting inconsistently. He asked, "What are you doing?" David and Bonin told him they had lost control. They had tried everything, and they couldn't understand what was happening. And that was true. At that moment, all three pilots were inside the same unknown. Outside the windows, nothing. Pitch black darkness. No horizon. No stars. No ocean. Just vibration, sound, and screams that didn't agree. Let's pause the scene. Right now, let's stop the story. The plane is still in the air. The engines are still running. But the countdown has started. This is the first minutes after the autopilot disconnect. Now, let's look at this moment, with the background included. What's in the cockpit and what isn't? At that moment, the captain was resting, exactly as planned. That wasn't unusual. The flight task division was normal. Pilot flying was Pierre-Cédric Bonin. Yes, he was the least experienced pilot, but that wasn't a mistake. That was how the system worked. The aircraft encountered an equatorial cloud system, and inside that cloud, something happened the pilots couldn't see. The pitot tubes, which feed airspeed data, began to freeze due to ice crystals at high altitude, and there was no screen in the cockpit that said, "Pitot tubes are frozen." So the result was, the airspeed indicators began producing conflicting data. The autopilot, unable to trust the data, disconnected itself. And now the reality for the pilots was brutal. The foundational requirement of flying, reliable airspeed data, wasn't there. Outside, no visual reference. Inside, no reliable data. No horizon line, no stars, no ocean, only darkness. Now, let's take a step back. It wouldn't be fair to compress everything into a single cockpit moment, because there were factors in the background. The pitot tubes used on Airbus A330s had already been receiving negative feedback before this crash. Airbus and airlines knew about the issue, and replacement programs had started. This particular A330 was also scheduled for a pitot replacement after landing in Paris. Meaning, this flight was among the last flights with that specific setup. The airline knew there was risk. but the 3 pilots on this flight were not given a special briefing about it. In training, pilots had practiced a version of this problem at lower altitude, but the high-altitude version, and how differently it behaves, wasn't truly drilled. Pilots had trained stall approach and recovery in the past, but most had never experienced a fully developed stall in a real aircraft. And because modern aircraft felt so reliable, extreme edge case training scenarios were limited. When the aircraft entered a stall, there wasn't a dedicated stall indicator in front of them. There was mainly a sound warning. And under extreme stress, the brain can filter signals, especially repetitive sounds. They can fade into the background. Now, let's look at what happened inside the brain. When Bonin had control, a choice was made. To correct the right roll, he used pitch-up input. That choice didn't look 100% correct under the conditions, but it also didn't look like something that would obviously lead to disaster, because what drove it wasn't conscious reasoning. It was reflex. From a neuroscience perspective, it looks like this. Uncertainty triggers stress. Stress activates the amygdala. When the amygdala is active, the prefrontal cortex gets suppressed. Analytical thinking weakens. The brain grabs the simplest, most familiar pattern it knows. Bonin wasn't inventing a decision. He was repeating something his training and experience had conditioned into him. And, in that moment, there was no visual reference, no trustworthy data reference, so the brain searched for stability. That was the first human error. But the deeper question is, how fair is it to place the weight of so many system-level factors onto one person in one moment? Second breaking point, when Fixable didn't get fixed. The Airbus cockpit design isn't like Boeing's in one major way. The side sticks are not mechanically linked. Whether that's a flawed design is still debated. But the unchanging fact is this: David Robert could not physically feel what Bonin was inputting. So, inside the cockpit, this dynamic became possible. 2 humans trying to save the same aircraft, but pulling it in different directions. And by then, even the sounds inside the cockpit had lost meaning. Was it an alarm, a warning, a system message? It became nearly impossible to separate signal from noise. Let's continue with the final minutes. They still couldn't make sense of what had happened. They asked the captain, "What do we need to do?" But the captain didn't know the true nature of the initial failure, and he hadn't been fully briefed on the climb that began at the start of the emergency. He was shocked. All he could say was,
"There, I don't know. There it's going down."
He tried to interpret the conflicting indicators. Bonin began asking,
Am I going down now?
David could only repeat,
Go down.
The captain, referring to Bonin's pitch attitude, insisted.
"No! You climb there!"
Bonin listened to the captain and moved in the opposite direction. For a few seconds, he pushed the stick fully forward. The aircraft accelerated into a descent. The stall warning came back.
Stall.
The captain
stall,
muttered.
"That's impossible."
Stall.
Bonin still
stall,
didn't release the
stall.
controls. When David shouted,
Climb, climb, climb.
Bonin replied.
But I've been at max nose up for a while.
That sentence finally made the captain understand what was really happening. He yelled,
"No, no, no! Don't climb!"
David pushed forward to descend, and even when he believed he had control, nothing changed. Because Bonin was still pulling back, and the aircraft kept receiving opposing inputs. After multiple dual input warnings, they were already down to around 4,000 feet. The captain shouted at David,
"Watch out! You're pitching up there!"
David replied that they needed to keep the nose up now, because they were at 4,000 feet. Then the cockpit voice recorder captured a system warning.
Sync rate, pull up.
The aircraft was around 2,500 feet. The captain changed his mind and shouted,
Go on, pull!
Both pilots pulled fully back. The aircraft's nose rose to about 16 degrees above the horizon. The last sounds in the cockpit were system descent warnings, and the pilots realizing they were about to hit the ocean. The captain gave one final command.
10 degrees, pitch up.
David tried once more to push the nose down, but because Bonin was holding the takeover button, it had no effect. And even if it had, there was nothing left to do. At 2:14:28, the Airbus A330 hit the Atlantic Ocean at a vertical speed of roughly 10,900 feet per minute, an impact comparable to falling from the top of a 50-story building. The aircraft shattered into thousands of pieces on impact. All 228 people on board died instantly. Final stop. Why couldn't he let go? The question people ask is usually this: why didn't he let go? But that question carries a hidden assumption, because in some moments, for the human brain, letting go isn't a real option. In that moment, the brain latched onto one thing. Continuing the same reflex felt like the only action that still preserved order. In cognitive science, this is called perseveration, a behavior that continues even when it's no longer working, even when it's damaging, even when stopping would be the better choice. This isn't just a mistake. This is the limit of the human brain. And that limit often only becomes visible when reality pushes a person past the edge. After the crash. When the aircraft hit the ocean, there was no Mayday call, no clear location report. That morning, at Air France headquarters, the flight was marked as missing. In the first hours, families couldn't be given a clear answer. We're not receiving a signal, they were told. There's no contact. Search operations began over the Atlantic with a joint effort involving Brazil and France. The first debris was found days later: seats, life vests, personal belongings floating on the surface. But the main wreckage was thousands of meters deep. The black boxes were not found quickly. In fact, it took 2 years. In 2011, from roughly 4,000 meters deep, investigators recovered the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. And from that moment on, the questions changed. Instead of, who is at fault, people began asking, what happened? After what unfolded in that cockpit, aircraft design, especially human-machine interaction, was re-examined with a different lens. Pilot training programs were revised. Autopilot disconnect scenarios, conflicting data, and high-stress decision-making exercises were expanded and taken more seriously. This crash showed aviation that some things had to be rewritten. Families of the 228 victims from 32 different nations filed lawsuits against the airline and the aircraft manufacturer. But in recent years, those cases ended without criminal convictions. The people who died in this crash forced the world to look again at what we call standard. And we can only hope that what remains for those left behind is at least meaning, lesson, and a kind of hard-earned awareness. Zoom out. This isn't a story about hunting for a villain. It's a story about human limits and how systems shape our choices. And science today gives us a few names for what happened. Cognitive overload. With multiple alarms, conflicting instruments, and time pressure, the brain can't process details. It has to simplify. Even if that simplification is dangerous, it clings to one narrow line. Startle effect. A sudden, unexpected event activates reaction before thought in the first seconds. That's not weakness. That's the nervous system's default setting. Automation surprise, handoff. When automation lets go, a human can feel suddenly naked. Control arrives, but context doesn't. And maybe the most important truth is this: a human is not an expert in a situation they've never been truly tested in. What this crash left behind isn't only court outcomes. What it left behind was a heavy lesson about human behavior. Watching this story from a distance is easy. Stopping and saying, "I wouldn't do that," is easy too. But this channel doesn't look at it from there. The question here is, when nothing is clear, when your brain is in alarm, when your sense of time and reality is collapsing, what would you choose? This isn't an accusation. It's a confrontation. This is a channel for people who choose not to judge from far away, but to ask, what could have happened in that moment? If you want to think through more stories like this with us, don't forget to subscribe. And in the comments, we want to ask you, in that cockpit, in that moment, if it were you, would you truly have made a different choice?